let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon.
I'll tell you a tale of peace and love.
Whack for the diddle and the dido-day.
Of a land that rules all lands above.
Whack for the diddle and the dido-day.
May peace and plenty be her share, who kept our homes from want and tear. Oh, God bless England is our prayer.
Whack for the diddle and the dido-day. Whack for the diddle and the dido-day. So we say, hey buddy, come and listen while we play. Whack for the diddle and the dido-day. When we were savage, fierce and wild.
Whack for the diddle and the dido-day.
She came like a mother to her only child.
Whack for the diddle and the dido-day.
She took us from primeval slime and kept our hands from want and crime, and sent us to heaven in their own good time. Whack for the diddle and the dido-day. Whack for the diddle and the dido-day. So we say, hey buddy, come and listen while we play. Whack for the diddle and the dido-day.
My guest today is author and lecturer Christopher Klein. He has written for numerous publications and websites, including the Boston Globe, the New York Times, National Geographic Traveler, the Harvard Magazine, Biography.com, SI.com, ESPN.com, and Smithsonian.com. He is also a frequent contributor on History.com, the website of the History Channel. He is the author of 4 books, including Strong Boy, The Life and Times of John L. Sullivan, America's First Sports Hero, The Die-Hard Sports Fan Guide to Boston, and Discovering the Boston Harbor Islands. His most recent work is When the Irish Invaded Canada, the incredible true story of the Civil War veterans who fought for Ireland's freedom, published in 2019. And that will be our topic of discussion today. Of the book, the Wall Street Journal says, Klein is keen to celebrate the idealistic Fenians with their audacious dreams of national liberation, but he doesn't fail to catalog the foolhardiness of their endeavors. His book should be pressed into the hands of any would-be insurrectionist looking for tips on how not to overthrow a tyrant. And we are very pleased to have the author with us today. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Rob. Great to be here.
So are you Irish that got you into these topics, or is that part of your heritage?
Yeah, I mean, you'd never know it by looking at my name. But yes, I am actually 3/4 German, or 3/4 Irish. The quarter German's what gave me my surname and probably my looks as well. But have very deep Irish roots and have sort of been drawn to that story about Irish American history. And the book prior to When the Irish Invaded Canada was a biography of John L. Sullivan, who was the last of the bare-knuckled heavyweight boxing champions, but was really the first Irish-American hero. And his story was sort of the coming of age of that generation of Irish Americans who were born in this country to those who left Ireland during the Great Hunger. So his story is really about the Irish coming of age in the late 1800s in America, whereas When the Irish Invaded Canada really is a story about that generation who were forced to flee Ireland and come to America in the wake of the Great Hunger.
So that concoction that made you, I'm pretty similar. I have about a very similar makeup of myself, so I can definitely relate.
It's the perfect blend of Irish temper and German stubbornness. I think is what I see on the T-shirts. So
I know your pain.
Yeah.
Chris, it is tradition here to accompany the discussion with a special brew. Today we have Ireland's oldest ale, Smithwick's Irish Red Ale, now part of Guinness. The Smithwick's Brewery was established in Kilkenny in 1710 and was operated by the Smithwick's family of Kilkenny, amazingly, until 1965, when Walter Smithwick's sold the brewery to Guinness. Smithwick's is now produced by the St. James Gate Brewery in Dublin. The ale is often mispronounced in America as Smithwick's. If one of your friends foolishly sidles up to the bar and incorrectly orders a Smithwick's, it's not exactly fighting words, but very nicely tell your uncultured companion the correct pronunciation is Smithwick's. This is also my time to ask you to subscribe to the podcast. Simply hit the subscribe button on the directory that you use and get the newest material right away. And to the growing list of listeners and supporters from 1,000 cities in more than 60 countries, I have to say thank you. And now I raise my Smithwick's Irish Red Ale very high. And to anyone who's made a stand against all odds, even if you tried to invade Canada with a mere 800 men, to any and all who've made a daring stand, I say cheers. So if you would set the stage for us, and let's go back prior to 1845, and of course the potato famine, and then the immigration that followed, but the relations between the British and the Irish had soured for hundreds of years before that.
Oh, yeah. And at the time period we're talking about, both Ireland and Canada are colonies of Great Britain. And if you're going to use today's parlance, you would say that the Irish who invaded Canada were radicalized by their experiences under the Union Jack, and it stretched back for centuries. So the luck of the Irish wasn't something that you wanted to have for many centuries of world history, because they had the poor fortune of being in the backyard of what would become the most powerful empire in the world in the 1800s. And for hundreds of years, the British colonized Ireland, and they tried to remake the Irish in their own image. And things were particularly bad if you were an Irish Catholic living in Ireland in the 1700s, under what were called the penal laws. So you couldn't openly worship, you couldn't send your children to a Catholic school teacher or have a Catholic school teacher come to your home to teach your children. You were not allowed to vote or hold public office. You couldn't own any firearms or a horse that was worth over 5 pounds. You were allowed to have one knife in your house as long as you had it chained.
Wow.
So that you couldn't use it against the local police. And then even in death, your rights were still restricted, because you were not allowed to have a Catholic priest preside over a graveside ceremony in Ireland. So you have, for centuries, the Irish are, in this attempt to remake the Irish in their image, they're trying to extinguish Ireland's Catholic religion, its culture, its Irish language. And then when the potato crop starts to fail in the 1840s and 1850s, there's a sentiment among the Irish who think that the British are trying to exterminate them altogether.
Well, and that animosity that you talk about, which lasted, as you said, for centuries, is taken in that immigration, and it's still felt when those Irish immigrants come to the United States. But let's turn to a different type of animosity and the border between the United States and Canada, which, of course, at that time, the British had controlled Canada, wasn't always as peaceful as it is today.
No. And that's what makes this story so striking, is that it sounds particularly absurd when we're viewing it through the lens of the present, where the United States and Canada share the longest peaceable international boundary in the world. But in the first American century, this idea of invading Canada is about as American as fireworks on the 4th of July. It was done with regularity. So even before the Declaration of Independence was signed, the Continental Army marches due north. So you have General Richard Montgomery, who marches through the Lake Champlain Valley of Vermont and seizes Montreal. Before he turned traitor, you have Colonel Benedict Arnold, who's taking another path up through Maine. And they will meet each other outside Quebec City, where there's a fierce battle that is fought on New Year's Eve in 1775 that turns out to be a devastating defeat for the Continental Army, and sort of ends that engagement in Canada. But this idea of taking Canada, which again is a British possession at the time, persists, so that when the War of 1812 starts, again, there's a lot of action that's going on across the border. And Thomas Jefferson had written that the taking of Canada would be a mere matter of marching, and it was not.
Right.
Something that seems to repeat through American history is sort of this assumption that Americans were going to be greeted as liberators in Canada, particularly among the French-speaking population, which Americans just assumed that they would want to leave the British Empire to become part of the United States. So you have a lot of battles that happen right around the border region. And the most famous incident of the War of 1812, of course, like when the British come in and torch Washington, D.C. Well, leading up to that, it was American troops that burned present-day Toronto, which was called York at the time. It was the provincial capital. And there were forces that came down in Canada and burned the small village of Buffalo to the ground as well. So there was a lot of activity going on back and forth across the border. And then after the War of 1812, there's ongoing disputes about where the border actually is between the United States and Great Britain. So there's a lot of diplomatic tension between the two. And then so as a result of no one knowing exactly where the border is, you have a series of ridiculous interactions with equally farcical names. So there's the Pork and Beans War of 1838,
right,
when there's a group of Mainers and New Brunswickers who are fighting over the same logging rights along the border. No shots are being fired. My all-time favorite is the Pig War of 1859. So this occurs out in the Pacific Northwest on San Juan Island, which was disputed territory. Both the British and Americans were making claims to it. But one day, there's an American settler who noticed a pig that was rooting around in his garden, and he shot the pig dead. And it turns out the pig was the property of the Hudson's Bay Company. So let's just say that things really got out of control, that this spiraled to the point that there were 500 American troops that were sent to the island, including General George Pickett, who later gained fame in the Civil War. And you had thousands of British troops and 5 warships that were sent to the island. So they just basically, for months on end, were just staring at each other. No shots ended up being fired, and the biggest combat threat was said just be the sheer boredom of nothing going on out there for months on end. But it does go to speak to the border tension that is there. And not to mention that the border itself was sort of this lawless no man's land that had smugglers and counterfeiters regularly crossing back and forth. So, today when we talk about border security, we're thinking mainly about the southern border of the United States. But really in the 1800s, we were thinking about the northern border of the United States.
So let's get back to the Irish specifically and the amazing story of James Stephen.
So James Stephens is an Irish revolutionary. And among the centuries of restrictions on the Irish civil rights also came, generations that would try to rise up and overthrow British rule. And you had that in 1798. You had another uprising that would occur in 1848. So in the midst of the Great Hunger, where you had Ireland, which was when the potato crop starts to fail in 1845, Ireland's an island with about 8 million people on it. And over the next 7 years, there's going to be 1 million who die of hunger, another 2 million who are forced to flee the island. And still to this day, Ireland has not regained that population it had before the potato blight arrived on the island.
Wow. Still today.
Still today. So the effects of the Great Hunger 150 plus years on is still being felt every day in Ireland. So even in the midst of this, though, there is this revolutionary movement that is taking hold of the country. And it's a very secular movement, too. It's not just Irish Catholics. It's Protestants and who are joining in, too. It's sort of a cultural movement, sort of centered around Irish identity. And a lot of the leaders were into Irish literature and Irish mythology. And James Stephens was one of the leaders of this Young Ireland movement. And they then attempt to have, in the middle of famine, a revolution. And predictably, those odds were just too much to overcome. And the revolution is quickly put down by British forces. And James Stephens, to me, has one of the really interesting stories of what happens during this Young Ireland rebellion, is that he's in a shootout with the local constabulary, is shot a couple times, and is left for dead on the side of the road. So to the British, they think that he is dead. But he manages to survive, and he'll use it to his advantage. So it's sort of like ripping a page out of the Mark Twain playbook, Tom Sawyer. He fakes his own death. So they run an obituary notice for him in the local Kilkenny newspaper. A coffin that's filled with rocks is buried in the local cemetery, but all the while, James Stephens is on the lam through the rugged mountains of the south of Ireland, and manages to plead his safety by he dresses up as a woman, gets passage to England, and crosses England without getting captured. And it's said that he may have actually spent the night right under Queen Victoria's nose across the street from Buckingham Palace. But he manages to flee to Paris. And it's from Paris that he, his revolutionary spirit is deepened by meeting other revolutionaries, because there's a lot of revolutions, failed and otherwise, that are going on all across Europe in 1848.
Right.
You get a lot of exiles who sort of all come together in Paris. So Stephens will hold on to this idea of having another revolution in Ireland. And after the Great Hunger subsides, he makes a trip back to Ireland and is convinced by 1858 that the time has come to start planning a next revolution. And he will form a revolutionary organization called the Irish Republican Brotherhood in Dublin on St. Patrick's Day in 1858. And that organization, you can draw a through line today. That same organization that James Stephens started in 1858 goes right through to the Irish Republican Army that we know in modern times in the Troubles in Northern Ireland. But that's where the genesis is, all the way back with James Stephens in 1858.
One of the most endearing things about the Irish, you kind of brought it up there, is against all odds, everything is not in your favor, and still they can find a flicker of hope and they take a swing. So it's still one of the most endearing things about the Irish.
It is, and it's sort of one of the takeaways from the book, too. I mean, the thing that's remarkable when you read the book is that these Irish revolutionaries really make the point that it's so critical for them to celebrate those who failed along with those who would succeed. Because if those people were not celebrated, then the next generation might not take that chance then in trying to cast off the British rule.
Yeah, why even try?
Yeah, so you have figures, and we'll talk about one of the descendants later, of men like Hugh O'Neill and Owen Roe O'Neill, who rise up during the first Queen Elizabeth's reign, who are still revered figures in Irish history, men like Robert Emmet, the men who were Young Ireland in 1848. They were all revered among Irish Republicans and revolutionaries, and none of them succeeded. And I think that in a way, that's sort of one of the takeaways I have from the book. What's sort of a lesson that we could learn from these Irish? And it sort of is that they needed to keep that torch of revolution alive to at least be able to pass off to the next generation. They knew that the odds were against them, and it wouldn't necessarily, the odds were long. And, when we see many Hollywood movies, right, the story ends with, the impossible odds are overcome. But that's not what real life is a lot of time.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that you don't put up that fight, because even if you don't see that success in your lifetime, maybe one of your descendants down the line will. So whether it's, a fight for civil rights or a fight against cancer, you may not be seeing the fruits of that labor in their lifetime. But it's important to have that fight, to try to have that groundwork in place that future generations can build upon and ultimately have that cause succeed. So, I think that's one of the inspiring things from reading a real life history like this.
One of the key components of the book is the Fenian Brotherhood. Could you talk about its formation and then its founder, John O'Mahony?
Yeah. So John O'Mahony is a colleague of James Stephens, and he is also among those participating in the Young Ireland Rebellion in 1848. He's not a militant. He was actually a Gaelic scholar. and had studied about Irish mythology. So he is part of this movement that's sort of celebrating the Irish culture as much as trying to have this overthrow of British rule in the country. So after the Young Ireland Rebellion, O'Mahony also ends up fleeing to Paris, and he will spend several years with James Stephens. And then in 1856, he will leave Paris and set sail to live in the second most Irish city in the world, and that is New York City at the time. And as James Stephens is forming the IRB in Dublin in 1858, O'Mahony is forming a sister organization in New York City at the same time called the Fenian Brotherhood. And this is really the first transatlantic revolutionary organization that has ever been formed. And the idea is that James Stephens is going to be putting together the army for the next revolution in Ireland that they're going to try. And with the freedoms that America provides, O'Mahony is going to be raising money among the Irish, purchasing weapons, and then sending them over to outfit James Stephens' army. So this is the plan that is in place when the two organizations were formed in 1858. And the word Fenian actually comes from Fianna, which is sort of these mythological Irish figures. If you ever heard of Finn McCool, he might be the most notable of them. But John O'Mahony, being this Gaelic scholar, sort of rebrands the Fianna and comes up with this word Fenian, which really is in use for the first time with the Fenian Brotherhood, and then would be used for decades after the Fenian Brotherhood had come and gone to sort of be equated with an Irish revolutionary. Today, it's still thrown around a lot of times in the British Isles and sort of a slur against Irish in a way. But when it will start is sort of taking these revolutionaries and placing them in sort of that Irish mythology that dated back, for millennia.
So O'Mahony is not alone in Irish immigrants that come to the United States. There are thousands upon thousands. Could you speak to, obviously we know the reasoning that they're coming. There's a destitution in Ireland, and then there's a political element to it as well. Where do they settle? And then when they arrive, many of them almost immediately get involved in the American Civil War.
Yeah. So, you have, of the 2 million who flee Ireland, you will have, some will go to Australia, some will go actually, to Great Britain, cities like Liverpool and Manchester. You will have over 1 million who then set sail from North America. Those who had probably the least money might actually take transit directly to Canada because it was a shorter voyage and also then it didn't cost as much. You have a lot of the Irish then who will stay in Canada, others then continue on southward into the east coast of the United States. You also then, of course, have many Irish who are going to land directly in the port cities along the Atlantic seaboard. And for many of them, because they are so poor, they don't make it much further than just a few miles from where they end up landing. So you have a lot of the Irish then settling in cities like Boston and New York and Philadelphia and Baltimore. And then to a lesser extent, cities like Charleston and Savannah and New Orleans as well. You will then get some Irish who then start moving out to Midwestern cities too, like Chicago and Detroit, Milwaukee, Cleveland. So the Irish really are concentrated in urban areas. Again, a lot of them don't have much money. They don't have money to go buy land. All their knowledge has really been in terms of farming. Ireland is a very agricultural place. So it's a huge culture shock for when they come to the United States. And it's a huge culture shock for America as well, because the Irish who arrive are unlike any of the newcomers the country had ever seen before. At a very basic level, they really are refugees more than immigrants. They're not necessarily hungering for American ideals as much as they are literally starving for food. And a quarter of them don't speak English. They speak the Irish language. But what really sets them apart is that they're practicing what for many Americans is a foreign and strange religion, that's Roman Catholicism. You have a country that was sort of built on the Pilgrims, Puritans, strict Protestant bedrock. And then all of a sudden you have by the tens of thousands in some of these cities, Catholics pouring in. And it's a huge culture shock that leads to this backlash with the rise of the know-nothings and nativist feelings in the 1850s, and the Irish really aren't accepted.
Right.
When the Civil War breaks out, to some of the Irish, this is a way for them to sort of prove themselves to other Americans. They're not necessarily enlisting out of a desire to free the slaves. If anything, they saw them as possible economic competitors. For a lot of the Irish, they join in the Civil War because it's a paycheck. You know, they're still at the bottom rung of the economic ladder. They don't expect the war to last that long. They'll enlist for 3 months, they figure, collect a paycheck, and then the war will be done. For those who are members of the Fenian Brotherhood, they also see a side benefit here of joining the Civil War as a way to learn about battlefield tactics and weaponry that they can then take back to launch this revolution in Ireland. And one of the most remarkable things I found in researching this book is there's an Irish scholar named Damien Shields who's done a lot of investigation into the participation of the Irish in the Civil War. So according to his calculations, he found there are about 200,000 native-born Irish who end up fighting in the American Civil War.
Wow.
Probably about 180,000 for the Union, 20,000 for the Confederacy. The side you were fighting on was really just based on more or less where you lived. For those Irish who lived in those port cities in the South, they would enlist with the Confederacy. They are fighting in overwhelming numbers. And as the war drags on, it's going to be the Irish who are dying in overwhelming numbers as well and suffering just terrible losses. I think maybe 30, 35,000 of them end up dying. Battlefields, particularly Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, they took very heavy losses at a lot of the key battles during the Civil War.
So you mentioned the Fenian Brotherhood is actually before the Civil War, and they're developing these plans almost immediately as the war ends. So what are these plans for the Irish Revolution that the Fenian Brotherhood has at the conclusion of the war?
So at the conclusion of the war, they're still on track with this original plan of raising money and weapons in America and then shipping them to Ireland. And the Fenian Brotherhood really gained strength in the months after the end of the Civil War. There's a lot of animosity towards Great Britain because of their conduct during the war in remaining neutral. A lot of people in the North think that the British were siding with the Confederacy. And not to mention that Confederate warships were being built in British ports and guns were being manufactured that the Confederacy used in Great Britain. So a lot of anger towards Great Britain. The Fenian Brotherhood is able to tap into that. And they start sending recruiters around to the mill cities in New England, the mining towns in Appalachia, and they try to gain membership for the Fenian Brotherhood. So they will stage like a night of Irish culture where they might have some Irish dancing, sing Irish songs. There might be, Irish baked goods, then speeches by the Fenian recruiters who then want to then have people join the Fenian Brotherhood, but also then donate money that they can use then to buy the weapons. And of course, at the end of the Civil War, you have the Irish who fought in the Civil War. Some of them are then going ahead and just purchase the weapons that they used during the war because they were made available to them. There's also, of course, this huge surplus then in both guns and ammunition. And the Fenian Brotherhood are taking the money that they're raising at these Irish culture nights and rallies. They stage rallies in New York City that will have as many as 100,000 people turn out there. And they use that money and they start buying weapons directly from the United States government surplus. And the Fenian Brotherhood, they actually sell war bonds. So in denominations from, $5 up to, $1,000 or so, that you would buy these war bonds and then they would be payable with interest 6 months after the Irish Revolution is successful. So there's this interesting side note that when actually Ireland gained its independence decades later, all of a sudden these bonds are coming out of people's drawers in America looking to get paid up.
Turning them in, yes.
Yeah, the government in Dublin has no idea what these things are, let alone that they're going to pay them out. But if you go on to eBay today, they're catching a pretty penny there. So if you do a search for Fenian Brotherhood war bonds, you can see what they were selling. So yeah, so they are raising, they're getting the weapons paid, they're raising a lot of money, and they're feeling good about this plan that they have. But in the fall of 1865, the British have easily infiltrated the IRB in Ireland and sort of know this plan that James Stephens is planning to imminently have this next revolution launched. And they crack down on the IRB. They arrest some of its leaders. They don't get Stephens. Stephens ends up going into hiding again. They take a lot of their weapons or records. They suspend habeas corpus. They basically cripple the IRB. So when that happens, it's happening at the same time that there's this changing attitude among the Fenians in America about how successful this revolution idea could be in Ireland, because it's been tried, of course, for generations and has never worked. They wonder how they're going to get all their weapons that they're getting after the Civil War over to Ireland, because they don't have a boat, let alone a navy. So they think that it's going to be foolhardy to have this revolution in Ireland like they had planned all along. So they think the better idea here is, why don't we just go to hit the British Empire, the place where we don't have to cross an ocean. We can just get on a train and be there overnight and walk right across, and that's going to be Canada. So when the IRB is cracked down in the fall of 1865, it really gives momentum to this idea among the Fenian Brotherhood, a segment of it, to switch tactic and launch an invasion of Canada. And it leads to a split in the organization, because John O'Mahony wants to stay with the original plan of having this revolution in Ireland, but he's going to lose out. And really the faction that wants to have the attack in Canada will end up taking control of the organization in 1866.
So I'm interested in that invasion plan because it's pretty intricate, but the person that develops it is really astounding. So General Thomas William Sweeney, could you talk about his background, because it's such a great story, and then the invasion plan that he develops?
Yeah, so Thomas William Sweeney, so this guy really is the epitome of the fighting Irish. He was born in Ireland, left with his family when he was a young boy. He's actually washed overboard on the voyage to America and manages to survive for 30 minutes in the cold Atlantic before he's rescued. And then when he gets to the United States, he will eventually enlist in the Union Army and fight in the Mexican War. And he is in a fierce battle in Mexico where he takes a gunshot to the groin, but keeps on fighting during the battle. And then he gets another gunshot that pierces his arm and requires it to be amputated. Most men would probably, that might be the end of their military career, but not for Sweeney. He stays in the Union Army. In fact, he will employ that Irish temper and get into a fist fight with one of his superior officers and whip him with his one good remaining arm. And then he will fight in the Civil War, and he's credited as being very instrumental at the Battle of Shiloh, although he, again, is shot twice in his one remaining arm and shot in the leg and manages to survive that. So what I find really remarkable about Sweeney is, so here's someone who, he's an immigrant for decades. I think came over maybe in the 1830s. So he spent most of his life in America. He spent 2 decades in the Union Army. He's given his arm to the cause of the United States. Yet after the Civil War, he's approached to become Secretary of War of the Fenian Brotherhood and devised this battle plan to invade Canada, and he takes the job, which just, I think, goes to show that this attachment back to the Irish homeland that was so deep. And Sweeney didn't live through the Great Hunger. He didn't see friends and family have to flee or the dying that was going on all around him, like so many of the Irish who end up being part of the Fenian Brotherhood did. So he didn't even have that sort of scarring experience, yet he still has this attachment to his homeland that he's going to join the Fenian Brotherhood and leave the Union Army after the end of the Civil War. And the war plan that he puts together is one that's pretty familiar. It's been trotted out before, notably during the War of 1812, and even though it didn't work, Sweeney wants to do it again. And sort of, once again, baked into his plan is that he, of course, is going to have an army of Irish Americans who he's going to send into Canada, but he fully expects that once the Irish cross into Canada, that all the Irish who have settled in Canada, and there's tens of thousands of them, he expects are going to want to leave British rule and join their cause as well. along with all the French-speaking population in the Maritimes and in Quebec, and he expects them all to greet the Fenians as they cross the border as liberators rather than conquerors. So that is part of his plan, and militarily, he has an amphibious invasion plan. It's a 5-pronged invasion. So starting in the west, he's planning for boats to be launched from Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and Buffalo across the Great Lakes and also the rivers that are separating America from Canada. And then those groups would all congregate and march on to Toronto. And this is all a feint. What Sweeney is hoping is going to happen is going to divert troops from what his real target is. He wants troops to leave Montreal and Quebec to go to Toronto, leaving those two cities exposed for the heart of his army, which he's planning on having 17,000 men marching right up through the Lake Champlain Valley, seizing Montreal, seizing Quebec City, and then having firm control of the St. Lawrence River, which is really the economic lifeblood of Canada. And then once they have that in control, the ultimate goal here is then to have the British free Ireland. And in essence, what they're planning on doing here is they're going to hold Canada hostage and they're going to ransom it for Ireland's independence. I mean, that's sort of at the heart of this plan among some of the Fenians. You know, I think maybe the best case scenario that they're hoping here, though, is to spark a war between the United States and Great Britain. Because, again, there's so much animosity towards the British at the end of the Civil War that the American government is seeking millions of dollars in reparations from the British government, not to mention that it has its eye on Canada as being added as the new territory to the United States. So I think a lot of the Fenians are hoping that they can spark this war, and then at the end of it, the United States will force Great Britain to give Ireland its independence as a thanks to the Fenians for helping them conquer Canada and have that territory be added as new states into the United States.
So as the book describes, that initial plan, that 5-pronged plan that Sweeney develops, almost immediately goes by the wayside, and they settle for a much watered-down plan. So the Irish invasion of Canada is still on. It's just not a 5-pronged plan. It focuses on Buffalo, and that's where the book talks about Colonel John O'Neill. Could you talk about the invasion that actually does occur and Colonel O'Neill?
So John O'Neill is really the central figure in when the Irish invaded Canada. He's going to play a role in each one. There's actually going to be 5 invasions of Canada between 1866 and 1871. He's got a hand in all of them. So he's really the through line to the book. And like Sweeney, he came to America as a boy, but unlike Sweeney, it was in the wake of the Great Hunger. So O'Neill was born in County Monaghan, which is sort of along the border, present-day border of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And as a young boy, he heard these tales of great ancestors that his grandfather told him about, like Hugh O'Neill and Owen Roe O'Neill, who I mentioned earlier, and that they were heroes just by daring to stand up and fight the British, even though they weren't successful. So he's learning a lot of these legends when he's young, and then he watches as the potato blight hits and his town shrinks by 25%. His family is broken up for a time. He eventually has to leave Ireland, comes to America, and he will fight in the Civil War and be wounded in action. And after the war, he didn't really have any interest in joining the Fenian Brotherhood because he thought this idea of invading Ireland was the foolhardy one. It's not until the idea comes along to invade Canada, he thinks that this is the great idea and joins over into the organization. And he's living in Nashville, Tennessee at the time, and he's in charge of a regiment of about 100 men. And when the invasion is launched at the end of May 1866 is when Sweeney sends word out to the division commanders like O'Neill to mobilize and start going north to the border. So O'Neill gets this telegram from Sweeney, says goodbye to his wife, goodbye to his 6-month-old boy, goes goodbye to his business that is doing very well and is worth a lot of money, and he's willing to leave it all behind, again, because he knows the odds are long, but he knows that the odds are always long against the British, and he just has this sense of history as well. So he has no qualms in joining in this invasion, but he finds out he's being sent to Cleveland. His orders are to go to Cleveland. He's going to cross Lake Erie in a boat and then march on to Toronto. Now, by the time he gets to Cleveland, the plan is starting to fall apart because one of the great ironies is that the Fenian Brotherhood, when it was established, was initially a secret oath-based organization. And it's for this reason that the Catholic Church would eventually rule that any members of the Fenian Brotherhood would be excommunicated from the church because you're not allowed to take any other oath to a secret organization. After a few years, the Fenian Brotherhood switched from being a secret organization to one that was not, but still was banned by the Catholic Church. So the great irony is that for an organization that was being, criticized by the Catholic Church for being shrouded in secrecy, the one thing that they could not do worth a damn was
keep a secret, right?
keep a secret. They were easily infiltrated by spies from the United States, Great Britain, and Canada. They all knew what was going on at the same time that the Fenians did. So when you get all these Irish getting on these trains up north, it's getting reported in the newspapers. So there's no secret invasion that's going on. And to compound things, a lot of the men that Sweeney had counted on showing up weren't in Cleveland. The boat's going to be found in Chicago. So he decides he's going to have to call an audible on his war plan, and he will send all the men that he possibly has from those Great Lakes cities to Buffalo, including O'Neill and his men. Sweeney's thought is that, all right, if we can just get into Canadian territory, everyone will be convinced that this is a serious operation, and he expects to have tens of thousands of Irish in America getting on railroad trains and falling right behind. And it's going to be this massive uprising. And plus, once we get into Canada, we're going to have all the Irish there helping us out. So we just need to get onto Canadian territory. So John O'Neill turns out to be the right man in the right place at the right time, because when he gets to Buffalo, he's about the highest ranking man that they can find. So he is the one who's put in charge of the 800 men who are hiding out in the Irish First Ward neighborhood of Buffalo. And for O'Neill, this really is sort of the moment that he feels like his whole life has been leading up to this moment, that, he's been destined to be in charge of an Irish army that's going to fight the English and kick the English out of Ireland. So he is thinking that he's fulfilling his life duty by doing that. And on the night of May 31st, 1866, the Irish come out from their hiding places in the First Ward of Buffalo. They march several miles up to a landing place along the Niagara River. In the middle of the night, they will cross on 4 barges over into Ontario, and they will pierce British soil with their Fenian flags and begin their invasion of Canada.
Another interesting part of this story, I think it's the USS Michigan is sitting there.
Yes.
And so that gets injected into the story too.
Yeah. So in spite of there not really being any secret about this Irish invasion of Canada, one of the bizarre things is that there are not any defense troops waiting on the other side of the Niagara River. And that's because that the Canadians were convinced that the invasion was going to be coming on St. Patrick's Day a few months earlier. So they had called out all their defense forces. They canceled all the St. Patrick's Day parades in all their major cities, and then nothing happened. So they were a little afraid of being the boy who cried wolf to do it all again. And the attitude sort of was that we've been hearing a lot of chatter about this invasion. We'll actually deal with it when it happens. So there's no Canadian defense forces that are waiting on the other side of the Niagara River. The only thing that could possibly stop them from crossing into Canada, the Fenians, is one American warship, which was the USS Michigan. So when reports come down to the dock that you've got these Irish Americans marching through the city with wagons full of weapons, the Captain Andrew Bryson gives the order for his pilot to put the boat out into the Niagara River to stop them. Unbeknownst to Captain Bryson, the Fenians actually have a sleeper cell on the USS Michigan. About 17 of the sailors are members of the Fenian Brotherhood, and they know that this boat is not going to go anywhere without its pilot. And the pilot's name is Patrick Murphy. Don't let the name fool you, however. Patrick Murphy has been a loyal sailor. It's part of the British Navy, the American Navy. He's going to follow whatever order that he's given. And the Fenians know that. So they know that the only way that they can sabotage the USS Michigan is to take Patrick Murphy out. And by that, I mean they take him out
on the town
to the saloon, a night on the town.
I love that.
To all the waterfront saloons of Buffalo, so that when Captain Bryson is looking around his ship for Patrick Murphy is reportedly being seen arm in arm with a young lady singing The Wearing of the Green as he's tippling his way through the streets of Buffalo. So the Fenians are able to cross into Canada, and it's not until the daylight hours that the USS Michigan is finally out into the Niagara River that it's too late to stop the Fenians from crossing over.
So O'Neill is successful then. He gets into Canada. The invasion has begun. It culminates in an actual battle, even though there's only 800 Fenians at the time, the Battle of Ridgeway.
Yeah, so this is going to occur on the morning of June 2nd, 1866. So the Fenians are in Canada for more than 24 hours before they finally encounter the first defense troops. And this is a small village called Ridgeway. It's probably about maybe 10 miles west of Buffalo, about 20 miles south of Niagara Falls. And John O'Neill on the morning of June 2nd is occupying a position on this limestone ridge outside the village of Ridgeway. And he can see coming at him is an army that's probably about 3 times his size. So he knows he's outnumbered, but he has the advantage of having a much more experienced army. So the men who are part of his army, a lot of them fought in the Civil War. In fact, you actually have men who are in battle wearing their Union blues and their Confederate grays. These are members of the Louisiana Tigers who come from New Orleans. So he's got an army of very experienced soldiers who aren't that far removed from being in battle, whereas these Canadian Defense Forces, some of them are farmers, never fired a gun in their lives. There's a regiment that's made up all of University of Toronto students. Some of them were studying for their finals. Got a knock on the door in the middle of the night saying, well, good news, you don't have to study for your finals anymore. The bad news is we need you at downtown Toronto at the drill shed at 4 a.m. tomorrow morning. We're going to be given a gun and shipped off to the southern border to repel the invasion. So the firefight begins in this, this farmland amid orchards outside the village of Ridgeway. And as the battle begins, the Canadians gain the upper hand with their superior numbers, but the Irish Americans can sort of see that they're flinching whenever gunshots are being fired, whereas the Fenian forces or, bullets are whizzing by everything, they're all used to it. So O'Neill, has never commanded an army before, he had been in the Civil War, but he proves himself to be pretty capable. And he ends up then with being outnumbered and being pressed very early on in this battle, will call his men back and do a very risky maneuver he knows they can only do with an experienced force. So he draws his men back, and the Canadians will overextend themselves. And sort of O'Neill waits for just the right moment, then comes charging over the top of this limestone ridge, top of a horse, and gives an order for his men to charge. And immediately the tide of the battle starts to turn, and the Fenians are very quickly gaining an advantage. And then compounded with that is the inexperienced Canadian commanders see John O'Neill on a horse and think that actually a cavalry charge is coming. The Fenian army has, I think, all of one horse, and it's the one that John O'Neill is on top of. So the Canadians will put themselves in a defensive formation for a cavalry charge that leaves them very exposed to the infantry charge that is coming instead. And very quickly then, these inexperienced Canadians will start seeing their fellow soldiers being shot, dropped to the ground. You have several of the boys who are fighting in that University of Toronto regiment, are shot, dropped to the ground, and quite naturally, you have these students. They just start running for their lives out of the battlefield. One of the groups involved here is called the Queen's Own Rifles, and them taking flight led to this derisive nickname then for the QOR was Quick Outer Ridgeway. The tables will be turned later on, several years later, where the Fenian Brotherhood will go into battle calling themselves the Irish Republican Army and very much do the same thing in a battle in 1870, and then were derided by the Canadians as IRA, standing for I Ran Away. But the upshot of this battle at Ridgeway is, it is a deadly battle. John O'Neill will emerge victorious. There are maybe 20 fatalities there. There are several students at the University of Toronto who were killed here. Unlike some of those farcical interactions, I mean, this is an actual battle with very deadly consequences. John O'Neill is victorious, but he discovers after the battle that, he's wondering where all his reinforcements are, and he doubles back then to their landing spot and discovers that the USS Michigan is now out in the waters and American troops have cut off his supply lines. And there's another firefight that happens after Ridgeway through the streets of Fort Erie, which is the town opposite Buffalo, that O'Neill, again, is victorious. But he knows that he's not getting any reinforcements and he's not getting any support from the Irish in Canada, and ultimately knows that he's got no choice, but he's got to retreat back to American territory in spite of this victory that he has at the Battle of Ridgeway.
So what's the U.S. Navy then do with the Fenians?
So Fenians will then retreat back to American territory on the night of June 2nd. And as they're crossing, Captain Bryce from the USS Michigan actually will arrest them all, declare them to be arrested. He's got hundreds of men out in the middle of the Niagara River, and he's got no place to put them. So he puts them on this open-air barge that he just ties to the USS Michigan. O'Neill and the other commanders will get better quarters on board the USS Michigan. And it's a good 48 hours that these Fenians are just exposed to all the elements, just standing out in the sun, battered by the rain, until Bryson gets word from President Andrew Johnson that Johnson is going to grant amnesty to all the rank and file Fenians if they would just go home. And in fact, the War Department will end up paying for the train fares for all the Fenian rank and file to go back home. O'Neill and the leaders, however, is a different story. They are going to have to stand trial. So O'Neill goes into a Buffalo courtroom where he's eventually released on bail with the help of a local Buffalo lawyer by the name of Grover Cleveland, who will, of course, become president of the United States.
Sure.
And eventually, the American government is going to drop all the charges against O'Neill as well.
What happened to all of the captured Canadian forces?
So before John O'Neill leaves Canadian territory, all of the Canadians they have captured, he orders them to be lined up in a row. And Canadians pretty much figure that O'Neill is going to execute him by a firing squad before he leaves Canadian territory. But instead, O'Neill starts going down the row one by one, shaking each man's hand and telling them that he's going to be back. And next time he's coming back with a much bigger army. Sort of like a Douglas MacArthur move here, right? About 80 years earlier. And John O'Neill is going to be true to his word. I mean, he is going to come back in 1870, 1871, sometimes with increasingly farcical results. But he's never going to let go of this idea of invading Canada for the rest of his life. And he's going to try it several times after that, in the wake of that Battle of Ridgeway.
So the last question I have for you today, of course, you mentioned several of those invasions when the Irish invaded Canada unsuccessfully. So what's the legacy of that?
Yeah, there's a few of them. One is that in the wake of the Battle of Ridgeway, the Fenians were successful in bringing self-government to one part of the British Empire, but it's just not the one they intended. Canada is going to have its own parliament take power on July 1st, 1867. So at the same time that the Fenians are invading Canada, it's in the midst of what was called the Confederation movement in Canada. There's this, Canadians wanted more self-government and not to be ruled directly from Parliament in Great Britain. In the wake of the Fenian raid of 1866, there's a lot of Canadians who were very disappointed, naturally, in terms of the lack of protection that the British gave them and allowed this invasion to take place, and helped to propel the Confederation movement, and then it will ultimately succeed so that July 1st, 1867, the first parliament is going to be established in Ottawa, which is this lumber town backwater at the time, but it's chosen over more prominent cities like Toronto or Montreal because Canadians wanted to have their capital far away enough from the American border for protection because of this legacy and this history of these invasions happening so frequently from the United States. So that's one impact. The other is that this transatlantic revolutionary organization that's put in place in 1858 is going to be in place there in 1916, the time of the Easter Rising, and it's ultimately going to be a crucial part of the Irish gaining independence from that Easter Rising generation. So when the Easter Rising happens and the Irish Proclamation is read outside the General Post Office, very prominent mention in the Irish Proclamation is given to the support of Ireland's exiled children in America, because that IRA was given weapons, was given money that would ultimately prove successful in leading to Ireland's independence several years later. So this whole idea that Stevens and O'Mahony had in 1858 is going to be proved successful in that Easter Rising generation in the 1910s, 1920s, when Ireland's War of Independence was fought. So, I think tying back to what I talked about earlier, I mean, that is sort of that ultimate legacy, is that these Fenians were able to keep the revolutionary torch alive from the younger Ireland generation and pass it along to the Easter Rising generation that's ultimately going to be successful after those 100 years of British rule of casting them aside.
Well, thanks, Chris. The book is excellent, by the way. It's fascinating. And so I appreciate your time and a couple of interesting characters and a great story.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.
I would like to thank my guest today, writer Christopher Klein. If you would like to find out more information about his writing, just go to ChristopherKlein.com. And if you would like to get a copy of his book, When the Irish Invaded Canada, just click on the link in the description below and actually get a signed copy sent right to you. Of the book, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Battle Cry of Freedom and the War That Forged a Nation states, from today's perspective, the invasion of Canada by Irish Americans seems to have the qualities of a comic opera, but these Fenians were deadly serious. Their example helped inspire the movement that led to the eventual success a half-century later. Christopher Klein's fresh telling of this story is an important landmark in both Irish and American history. The featured brew was Smithwick's Irish Red Ale, the oldest ale in Ireland, now brewed at the St. James Gate Brewery in Dublin. If you would like to get more information on the podcast, like the History A Go-Go Facebook page, and you can check out our YouTube channel as well. I would also like to remind you once again to subscribe to the podcast. That way you can get the newest episodes right away with no waiting. The music was provided by the North Carolina band Bones Fork. And if you want to find out what they have going on, just click on their link. It's in the description below. And I have to give a big thank you to the Merry Wallopers for allowing me to use their song, God Bless England. And if you haven't checked out this group yet, you gotta do it. Their link is in the description below also. And to all of the supporters and listeners from around the globe, once again, I have to thank them. There are many more great episodes on the way, with discussions on the presidents versus the press with Harold Holzer, JFK and baseball, and an interesting history of the writing of the Bible. So join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.
Our fathers oft were naughty boys.
A whack full of diddle and the dido day.
Our guns and pikes are dangerous toys.
A whack full of diddle and the dido day.
From the GPO to Boland's Mill, we made Mother England cry her fill. But old Britannia loves us still.
A whack full of diddle and the dido day. Whack full of diddle and the dido day. So we say, hey buddy, come and listen while we play. A whack full of diddle and the dido day.
Now Irishmen forget the past
Whack full of diddle and the dido day.
and think of a day that's coming fast,
Whack full of diddle and the dido day.
when we shall all be civilized, neat and clean and well advised. How won't Mother England be surprised?
A whack full of diddle and the dido day. A whack full of diddle and the dido day. So we say, hey buddy, come and listen while we play. A whack full of diddle and the dido day. Whack full of diddle and the dido day. So we say, hey buddy, God bless England. So we'll say, whack full of diddle and the dido day.
Sassenach amok.